It's my pleasure to introduce you tonight to Sam Anderson and Kathryn Schulz. Sam Anderson is the critic-at-large for the New York Times Magazine. He is the recipient of the National Magazine Award for Essay and Criticism and the National Book Critics Circle Balakian Award for Excellence in Reviewing. He's here tonight to talk about his book, Boomtown, the fantastical saga of Oklahoma City, its chaotic founding, its apocalyptic weather, its purloined basketball team, and the dream of becoming a world-class metropolis. And it's always interesting to have writers who are also book critics and to see how their books are received by critics. That's always a lot of fun. But this book is actually getting a lot of really great reviews. The Washington Post called it a nuanced, immersive portrait of Oklahoma City, and the New Yorker described it as a, quote, curious, hilarious, and wildly erudite book, and I can vouch for that. As its title suggests, this book covers a lot of ground. I learned, for instance, a lot about basketball. I was starting from scratch, so besides that, also about the American West, urban planning and its eventual renewal, infrastructure, supersonic jets, civil rights, meteorology, and of course how all these stories are woven together into the fabric of Oklahoma City and its people. Sam is joined in conversation tonight by Kathryn Schulz, author of 2010's critically acclaimed Being Wrong, Adventures in the Margin of Error. She's a staff writer at The New Yorker and the winner of the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for Feature Writing. Please join me in welcoming Sam Anderson and Kathryn Schulz.
Should I use the podium to read? You said yeah, this is right here. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. Kathryn Schulz also won the Balakian Award for Excellence in Book Reviewing, but when you win a Pulitzer Prize, it just nukes all of your other awards and they never get mentioned again. Okay, thank you so much for coming out to listen to us talk about Oklahoma City. My wife texted me the other day and said I was at the end of a bunch of book events, and she texted me just out of the blue and said, I can't believe you wrote a book about Oklahoma City. I said I was doing it for like 5 years, but it just struck her fresh. It strikes her fresh all the time. Why did this happen? I'm not from Oklahoma, but we can get into why it happened. The place totally sucked me in. I think it's like one of the great, almost mythological places of America and of the world. And I'm going to read just a bit about its origin story, the city's origin story, in this event called the Land Run. So I'm gonna hop around a little bit because I just want to give you kind of a sampling, and my book actually is a very hoppy book. So I'll be flipping here and there, and don't worry. Okay, this is a little section called Microwave Popcorn. When does a city begin? In most cases, we have no idea. We are forced to invent origin stories. Wolves raising twins, eagles carrying snakes. The volcano god belches. Civilization. We want the birth of a city to make sense, to be grand. We want it to lend its citizens meaning. But the reality is almost always far less dramatic. Cities creep into existence, like algae. It's silly to talk about beginnings. By the way, if you have the book, I'm on page 35 if you want to read along. No one is standing there firing a starting gun. There's no primordial boom. It happens in slow motion over generations, by accident. Travelers stop by a river to rest. They have babies. They attract and seduce enemies. They trade with rivals. They congregate. And then one century, there are enough of them. The babies of 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 the babies to call citizens. Celts and Romans and Anglo-Saxons and Normans cross a muddy river until after a few millennia, they congeal into London. Cavemen in Genghis Khan simmer into Beijing. The details are almost entirely lost to us. Later, we can do the science, and if we're lucky, we can pinpoint a century or a decade or even a year in which the city began. But we'll never know what most cities were like during their very first hour, minute, second. It doesn't even really make sense to ask. Cities are not microwave popcorn. Unless you are talking, as we are, about Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City is microwave popcorn. It was born all at once. It has a birthday, April 22nd, 1889, noon. Precisely at that moment, history flipped a switch. Before, there was prairie. After, there was a city. Oklahoma City was born in an event called, with extreme dramatic understatement, the Land Run. The Land Run should be called something like Chaos Explosion Apocalypse Town, or Reckoning of the Doom Settlers, Clusterfuck on the Prairie. It should be one of the major events in American history. Dramatizations of it should be projected onto IMAX screens with 3D explosions in endless loops forever. Because the Land Run was, even by the standards of America, absurd. It was a very bad idea, executed very badly. It would be hard to think of a worse way to start a city. Harper's Weekly, which had a reporter on the ground, called it one of the most bizarre and chaotic episodes of town founding in world history. A century later, the scholar John William Reps reviewed the evidence and concurred. The founding of Oklahoma City, he wrote, was the most disorderly episode of urban settlement this country, and perhaps the world, has ever witnessed. It's hard today to imagine the scale of it, the idea of so many people wanting so desperately to move to Oklahoma. But it happened. And then I do a little recapping of how this happened. The tribes were essentially kicked out of the center of Indian Territory, and then Congress was convinced to allow white settlers from around that territory to pour in on one afternoon. When President Harrison signed the document announcing the date of the Land Run, his signature sent a bat signal out over the end of the 19th century. Oklahoma was a gift, a free chunk of America for anyone who needed it. But it was also an emergency. It was free only to those who could get there first. The hysteria spread worldwide. People rushed from everywhere. European ports from Liverpool to Hamburg teemed with sudden, as they were sometimes called, Oklahomaists. There were Scots and Swedes, bands of Mormons from Utah. Classified ads appeared in the newspapers of Chicago and New York, calling for meetings of potential settlers. Many of the invaders were businessmen, legal and illegal, looking to exploit the coming boom market. Others were destitute, traumatized Civil War veterans, farmers ruined by drought, beggars. In southern Kansas, the villages near the border of Indian Territory, the buffer zone, exploded into temporary boom towns. Suburbs of tents spread in every direction: tent casinos, tent brothels, tent churches, tent hotels, tent restaurants, and tent newspapers. Swindlers arrived to siphon off the settlers' money. Dreams of new lives went up in smoke. Sham real estate agents tricked people into buying property in Oklahoma City, Texas. They just made it up on the spot. Some settlers ran out of money before the run even started and had to go begging in the shantytown streets. Others just gave up and went home, not only ruined, as they had been when they'd arrived, but now double or triple ruined. Something like 100,000 settlers showed up to wait for the starting gun, roughly the entire population at the time of Indianapolis. It was far too many people for the amount of good land available. But from the very start, Oklahoma was an idea that far exceeded its reality. The border of Oklahoma, this magic threshold to which settlers flocked from all over the world, was as tenuous as a border could be. It was more than 300 miles long, and in many places unmarked. Where it was marked, it was often only with barbed wire, or a creek, or a pile of stones. It was impossible to fully patrol. Rumors circulated about nefarious schemes. Cheaters, it was said, planned to sneak in early and burn the railroad bridges so no one could follow. A French hot air balloonist planned to hover just over Oklahoma until noon, then descend onto his favorite spot before anyone else had a chance. The only thing everyone knew for sure was that they needed to get to Oklahoma first. Time started to twist into itself. Every man wanted to be 15 minutes ahead of everybody, one observer wrote, and not 15 minutes behind anybody. All right, everybody's lining up on the border, and I'm going to take you to the moment they start running, which is noon, of course. Okay, so it was noon. What is noon? If you think about it hard enough, like a stoner or a phenomenologist, the concept of noon starts to get fuzzy around the edges. Is it a clock fact, 12 o'clock? Or is it an astronomical fact, when the sun is directly overhead? And who gets to decide? If it's about the sun being directly over you, then strictly speaking, in solar terms, every single place on Earth, my house, your left foot, your right foot, would have a subtly different noon. On April 22nd, 1889, the settlers of Oklahoma thought very hard about noon. All around the unassigned lands, noon became a fluid concept. Wristwatches along the border were found to differ by as much as half an hour. Unsupervised settlers went with whatever version of noon seemed most advantageous. They squinted at the sun, trusted their guts, and made a run for it. In some places, there were official signals. On the western border, the military fired its howitzers, loud little snub-nosed cannons, to give people permission to run. In the south, 5,000 people stood in the middle of a river, trying not to sink into the quicksand, waiting for a soldier to blow his bugle. In the north, soldiers held a rope taut across the border to keep the settlers back. Eventually, non-synchronously, the various noons came. The land run began. The people poured in. The moment the bugle touched the bugler's lips, before he'd even squeezed out a note, the settlers burst through the rope. Oklahoma was born. Rich men rode racehorses they'd bought for enormous sums only days before. Farmers rode broken-down mules. A handful of eccentrics peddled bicycles. Poor people walked. All over Oklahoma, the people came. Some settlers stopped just across the border, claiming the first open land they could find. Most, however, raced deeper into the territory. They wanted the good land, the prime plots near the rivers or the railroad tracks, or even better, where the rivers and the railroad tracks converged. Oklahoma City was one of those places. These hypothetical towns pulled in settlers like magnets. The country was rough, and the settlers' wagons weren't designed for it. They hit dry creek beds or buffalo wallows and busted apart. The drivers flew out, got up, limped on. Before long, the prairie was covered with wrecks. Spooked horses threw their riders. At least one man fell and broke his neck. Other horses died of exhaustion. One settler fired his gun to speed up his horse, but accidentally shot and killed another settler. It was absolute chaos, an explosion of humans. Actually, it was like a reverse explosion. Tens of thousands of people, who had been scattered across the globe, who had never had any reason to think they might be connected in any way, were suddenly thrown in tumbling chaos from every direction to assemble together at last in a dense core in the middle of America. And let me read you just a bit of what happened on the site of Oklahoma City where they were headed. Because there's kind of a great scene from the history books where posted out at this spot where the river and the railroad crossed, they had an army platoon waiting to keep order when the settlers finally arrived. And it was 15 miles away from the border of the unassigned lands. So they figured a man riding a horse at top speed would take roughly an hour to get there. And so they were pretty reasonably expecting one last hour of silence out in the middle of the prairie. But they were wrong. Oklahoma City happened immediately. The bugle notes had yet to fade when, like some kind of ancient creation myth, the empty landscape sprouted people. It was an ambush of settlers. Almost like the rush of jackrabbits from cover, the historian Stan Hoig describes it, men suddenly appeared out of the long grass around the depot area, bounding here and there. They dropped from the leafy branches of trees. They crawled out of and from under freight cars. They sprang from gullies and bushes. They poured from the few buildings at the station, and they suddenly came galloping up on horseback from nowhere. These were, in the lingo of the times, Sooners or moonlighters. We would call them cheaters. They had been waiting for this moment for years. Some had been hiding out in the wilderness around the station, illegally, for weeks or months, living in holes or bushes or improvised huts, dreaming of the glory of Oklahoma City. Some had leaped off moving trains just the night before, thumping and rolling over the prairie at high speed, breaking various bones, a physical tax on early entry that they were perfectly willing to pay. At the sound of the bugle, all of the cheaters came running. The land was free, they knew, only for those who got there first. There weren't nearly enough troops to stop them all, and there was too much chaos to even know whom to stop. An entire crew of surveyors popped out of the wilderness, complete with their equipment, chains and poles, and started organizing the prairie on the run, marking off lots and blocks on a completely theoretical main street. 20 minutes after the bugle sounded, there were already 40 tents set up. By 12:45, 15 minutes before Captain Stiles had expected to see his very first settler, the city's best spots had all been taken. By the end of the day, tents would stretch to the horizon. It looked, according to Harper's Weekly, like a handful of white dice thrown out across the prairie. The wildflowers were crushed, the soil torn up. The frogs and ducks and prairie chickens had scattered. In a matter of hours, one settler wrote, the natural beauty of the scene was completely obliterated, beyond recognition of hope or hope of repair. Should I stop there? Should I read more about cheating? You guys want to hear? I mean, there's some pretty amazing cheating there. Let me read you a little, because this is ingenious stuff. Okay. All right. It was pirate civics. The men who were supposed to be helping Captain Stiles, the U.S. Marshal, and his deputies, were busy instead grabbing the best land for themselves. Most of the deputies had signed on only for this purpose, and they took the bugle call as a signal of their resignation. Technically, government officials were not allowed to claim land, but practically it was a free-for-all. The railroad station's postmaster left his post office, a converted, dirt-floored chicken house, and claimed 160 acres right on the edge of town. One military man who'd been stationed just outside Oklahoma City to guard against cheaters spent the weeks leading up to the land run building a house on rollers so that he could move it at noon to his favorite site in the area. People claimed land not only for themselves, but for distant relatives who never intended to come to Oklahoma, and for fictional characters they invented on the spot. The settlers of Oklahoma City explored the nearly infinite gradations between cheating and non-cheating. One man who'd sneaked into the town site early soaped up his horse to make it look foamy, as if he'd just galloped a long way. Another shaved off his beard and dyed his mustache black so no one would recognize him. Just after 2 p.m., in the middle of all that chaos, the first train of settlers pulled into Oklahoma Station. It was 24 cars long. Settlers were hanging off the sides and clinging to the roof. Heads and arms were sticking through the broken windows. Eyewitnesses said it looked like a giant centipede wriggling toward the city. As the train began to slow down, passengers came spilling out from all sides. They hit the ground, rolled, and went sprinting for lots. According to one settler, the whole country where the city now stands was black, with a surging, crowding, running, yelling mass of humanity. It seemed, another would remember, as if some thousands of human beings had gone mad. The town site had only one well, and an enterprising settler cornered it immediately, standing on top of it, guns drawn. He set up a lucrative business charging 5 cents per drink, an exorbitant price that the people, their throats clogged with prairie dust, had no choice but to pay. Eventually, Captain Stiles' soldiers seized the well and returned it to the public. Let's do "Oh Joe, here's your mule," and then we'll stop. Last bit. The first night in Oklahoma City must have been profoundly disorienting. Some combination of sleepover, refugee camp, Super Bowl tailgate party, sit-in, and Visigoth raid of Imperial Rome. At dusk, as if by agreement, the settlers of the new city all stopped working. They laid down their hammers and rifles, took a break from jockeying for plots. They made campfires. It was the end of what would have been, without exception, the strangest day of everyone's life. These former strangers had become, in no time at all, a single town. Oklahoma City from that point on would grow and fast forward, a parody of a normal city. Within days, there would be wooden houses, slapped together quickly out of pre-assembled frames. Within months, brick warehouses and shops. Within years, grand stone mansions. Within decades, skyscrapers, convention centers, sports arenas, all the precursors of the 21st century Renaissance. That first night, however, it was only dirt. Dirt on the ground, dirt in the air. The soil, having lost the anchor of its plants, blew around freely in the wind. The day had been hot, but the night was uncomfortably cold. Fortunate settlers had tents. Those who didn't just lay on the ground, strangers side by side, packed together for warmth. I meant to warn you guys about my occasional cursing. It just happens, and here comes one. My editor tried to make me cut the sentence like 8 times, and I just kept saying, it makes me laugh every time I read it. I think it's... okay, they're laying on the ground packed together for warmth. Centipedes swarmed all over the place, wondering what the fuck was going on. Men walked together through the night, talking. New residents continued to arrive in the dark. As Oklahoma City struggled to settle down to its first night of sleep, something strange happened, an incident that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. Between 10 p.m. and midnight, accounts vary, a man's voice suddenly penetrated the silence. It was deep, slow, and loud enough to carry all the way across the new city, over the tents, the railroad tracks, the cottonwoods, the river, to every one of the 10,000. The message it carried was clear, but mysterious. "Oh, Joe," the voice called out, "here's your mule." This phrase hung in the air, not explaining itself, until suddenly another resident echoed it, every bit as loud. "Oh, Joe, here's your mule." The voices crossed, and then other settlers started joining in. "Oh, Joe," they called, "here's your mule." It turned into a kind of game. Soon the landscape filled with voices, shouting the nonsensical mantra louder and louder. "Oh, Joe, here's your mule." On a hill a mile from town, Captain Stiles and his troops heard the call, and they joined in too. It was coming now from everywhere, out of sync, overlapping. The words didn't matter anymore. The particular man and his mule, if they even existed, didn't matter. As far as most people knew, there was no Joe. There was no mule. The words were a closed loop, an incantation through which Oklahoma City was going to chant itself into existence. This was an experiment in civilization. The place was so new and precarious, so strange, that its residents had to shock themselves into community, using whatever method they could find, the way a human body, freezing to death, tries to generate its own heat by shivering. Perhaps that crazy late-night shouting could create just enough of a bond to allow Oklahoma City to withstand the turbulence of the next several days, years, decades. It was later reported that "Oh, Joe, here's your mule" spread that night across the entire unassigned lands, across Indian territory, more than 100 miles, all the way back up to Kansas. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Sam. Can you guys hear me?
That reading that in Oklahoma City was fun because I said to the crowd, and a voice called out over the town, and do you know what it said? And like many people were like, "Oh, Joe, here's your mule."
Sam, let me start by telling you guys something, which is I've actually known Sam a decade now, something like that. Yep. So long before this book was even a glimmer in his eye, and I, like probably a lot of huge Sam Anderson fans, including, I'm guessing, all of your various editors, thought, Oklahoma City. Like, okay, if anyone can pull it off, you can pull it off. And in fact, I will also take a moment to say, absolutely, you did. It's a truly sort of improbably wonderful book, and I do encourage all of you to pick up a copy and take it home. It's incredibly joyful and strange and interesting, and whatever your feelings about Oklahoma City, teaches, I think, all of us a ton about everything from urban planning to Americanness to just what it means to try to live with a bunch of strangers in some kind of remotely decent fashion. It's incredibly gripping. As I said, improbably gripping. But Sam, why don't you actually answer everybody's question for us to get things started, which is, in a universe of incredible ideas and places and people, why Oklahoma City?
Okay, so, I mean, there's several ways to answer that. The most straightforward way is because my editor one day was standing in his office at the Times magazine and said, "We need you to write a big, colorful cover story about something. What's it going to be about?" And I said, as I usually do, I don't know. And he said, and he's just kind of spitballing at this point. He's like, well, let's see, you're a basketball fan, right? I've been a pickup basketball player all my life and a big NBA fan since I was a little kid. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, the finals just ended and this team from Oklahoma City was in it, right? I said, yeah. He said, they seem interesting. I said, they're fascinating. I mean, they were a brand new team. They had just, the city had just, let's say, acquired. People often say stole the old basketball team of Seattle, the Supersonics, and taken it to Oklahoma City. And almost instantly, they became this powerhouse in the NBA. And they had like the youngest roster in the entire league. And they had these 3 future absolute superstars who were kind of coming into their own at that time. Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, and James Harden. And it was in many ways a very improbable team. And I said, I'd love to go check it out. And he said, yeah, fly out to Oklahoma City, see what's happening there. And that was the genesis of this book. And all of my writing career, I've been waiting for that feeling, you know? I think you have the same thing where you need to connect on some very deep, like secret level with the subject to make it into a book. And for me, it had been maybe well over 10 years of magazine writing, and I'd written many kind of long feature stories. And, you know, you always get emails from people, hey, you should turn that into a book, people in the publishing industry or something. And I would say, I don't want to write a book about iPhone games. And I'm waiting. I wanted my first book to be special to me. And Oklahoma City gave me that feeling immediately. The other thing I think that fed into that is, I think, like you also, many of my writing heroes are the ones who pull off this trick of taking something that is not famous, that is not obviously thrilling, and making it thrilling. I mean, one great example is like John McPhee, one of my ultimate heroes, who wrote the incredible book Oranges, about the orange-colored fruit, the orange. It's like a little parlor trick, you know, and there's like this whole tradition of the English essay that I really got into in college, where people would write about anything, like G.K. Chesterton. Do you ever read him?
A little bit.
Yeah, he'd write these collections. Like he wrote a collection called All Things Considered. I think that's where NPR got its. And he would write about, like, there's an essay called On Chasing One's Hat. And it was about when your hat blows off and you have to chase it. And it becomes this incredible philosophical exercise about human experience, or on drawing with a piece of chalk, on a piece of chalk, I think it's called. So I loved that. A writer like Nicholson Baker, who wrote his whole first novel, The Mezzanine, about like in the head of this guy who's riding an escalator back up to work after his lunch break. So I wanted to do something like that, and Oklahoma City for me was the subject. That was at the same time huge and universal and like eternal, but also small and neglected and ignored.
Life is so surprising. I mean, it's really wonderful that Oklahoma City was the thing that gave you this immediate feeling. I am curious, you just rattled off a list of kind of interesting influences that are sort of orthogonal to the kind of book you were writing, meaning I know what you mean. They're these kind of private obsessions that spiral well beyond the bounds of the subject matter. But were you also considering, or in the course of writing this, did you read other kinds of urban biographies, as it were, or did you have kind of project-based models in mind that looked at a place like Travels in Siberia or On the Res or any of these kinds of books that also try to go in very close on a particular place?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, like The Power Broker is always sort of looming. There's kind of a Robert Moses-like figure in this book, who's kind of like the Oklahoma City version of Moses, who has even more power because there are just fewer checks on him in this kind of distant prairie town. What's that book? Prairie Earth. Do you know this book? By what's the author's name? William Least Heat Moon. Did I get that right? Yeah. It's so brilliant, it almost made me stop writing. There's one description where he's writing about a little north of where I'm writing about, but he's kind of writing about the prairie in this like beautiful psychogeography. And there's one spot where he's like, put your fist on the table in front of you. And like, that's the shape of the place he's writing about. And he takes you like through the knuckles and stuff. And I just thought, that's too brilliant. I can't do this. So yeah, there were and there were others. I mean, John McPhee, The Pine Barrens, where you just find like strange tour guides who lead you through a place, and you take the reader through the history of that place. And what's his name? The great city writer who I quote in here, The History of the City. The guy who's kind of obnoxious but incredibly erudite, mid 20th century. Help me out.
Lewis Mumford.
Yep, Lewis Mumford. Yeah, right? Brilliant. And kind of aggravating sometimes, but also brilliant at a level that makes you kind of want to stop writing. I remember reading in that book, I think it's called The History of the City. It's really thick. And one of the things I remember having my mind blown by, it's an amazing book, was in ancient Greece, the houses were so kind of shabby and built largely of earth that the easiest way to break in and rob a house was to dig through the wall.
Sam, you are incredibly self-aware in this book about the fact that you are writing about a place that might not, on the face of it, be of intrinsic interest to, the average passerby who's not from Oklahoma City. But I was curious, and you make an incredibly compelling case for it, and it becomes a book that is, in fact, about both, in the best sense, simultaneously about Oklahoma City and in some ways not at all about Oklahoma City. I was curious, the other thing that your book is just hugely about is basketball, which, even granted that there are probably more NBA fans than Oklahoma City fans, it is still a very, it's a powerful choice, meaning some number of people are going to be passionate about basketball and some number of people, including your current interlocutor, will know almost nothing about basketball and need to be quite motivated to read about it. Did you, I'm curious what, in the balance of writing this book, to what extent was that your access in, and you were very clear that it was going to be as much of the book as it was? What did it let you do, and kind of how did it wind up steering the book, in the sense that sports are simultaneously incredibly central to our culture in all kinds of ways, and at the same time, quite a bit at a remove from a lot of the day-to-day life of a city or people? Yeah,
I think in that way, it's a perfect kind of vehicle for talking about this place, because it means everything and nothing at the same time. And to me, like I said, I've been watching the NBA since I was a kid, and the NBA was really taking off. And as a kid, when the NBA had, throughout the 80s, so much cultural juice, all of a sudden, you've got Michael Jordan and Charles Barkley and Magic and Larry, and it became, for me, a kind of mythology. There was like almost a religious aspect to it. And so I really wanted to treat the basketball in this book as a kind of mythological story that runs alongside this mythological kind of history of the place itself. So I think sports allows you as a writer to tap into kind of these narratives that are very powerful, because, you have a timed event at the end of which someone will have won and someone will have lost. And when you start to break down a city's relationship to a team, especially a city as desperate to be considered relevant and important as Oklahoma City, that suddenly has this powerful piece of culture, a professional basketball team, right? Which only 30 cities in the country have. And Oklahoma City is not naturally one of those cities that you would expect to have it. So for them, it means quite a bit more than it does for a normal city, a larger city. And so the people really kind of lived and died on the success or failure of that team. And the team itself is kind of woven into the fabric of that city on so many levels too. So that's the first thing I realized going out there to report on the team, was that, you could trace its influence in every other area of the city. And one example I give in there is the thing most people know about Oklahoma City is the horrible bombing of 1995, the federal building. Many, many people in Oklahoma City will tell you that the arrival of the Thunder and the instant greatness of the Thunder, and the way that the Thunder were suddenly not only racing through the playoffs, but in the NBA Finals. And if you turned on national TV networks, they would cut to commercial, and what would you see? You'd see the skyline of Oklahoma City, this place that had been ignored and mocked, and if anything, present in people's minds as this site of tragedy. And suddenly it was a site of glory and relevance. And so a lot of people connect those two things, and they say the thunder helped us recover from the horror of the bombing. And it's a place where instead of coming together in tragedy, we now come together, 41 home games a year plus the playoffs to rejoice. 18,000 people together to rejoice. You never could get 18,000 people physically together in downtown Oklahoma City before that. There was just no reason to do it. Maybe for a Garth Brooks concert. But so it is this hugely powerful thing, and the Thunder is very conscious of that. And whenever a new player joins the team, like they traded for, Paul George, this big star last year. Well, before Paul George gets to put on a uniform and play a game, he has to go take an official tour of the bombing memorial. Every player has to do it. Even a player I got to know pretty well who grew up in Oklahoma City, he's the one player ever who grew up there. He remembers the bombing. He was 4 years old. Even he had to go take a tour of the bombing memorial. So it's really linked into the identity of the team.
You just described Oklahoma City as a place that's desperate to be taken seriously as a city. And I'm very curious. I know it's early days. So far, how is this book being received in Oklahoma City? On the one hand, it's like the wildest dreams of like the tourism board of the city that like Mr. Fancy New York Times Magazine writer is going to come and write this like epic, wonderfully well-received book about the city. On the other hand, it is, and I mean this as the highest possible praise, not at all pure boosterism. And so I'm just curious, what's the take?
Yeah, it is a place where boosterism runs wild. I mean, you read some of these local histories of the place, and it's just laugh out loud stuff. I mean, it's like there's this guy, the kind of Robert Moses figure of Oklahoma City, this guy Stanley Draper, who does the most crazy things to the city. I mean, they did urban renewal. What fascinated me in the end was like every motion that a normal 20th century American city made, Oklahoma City made times a million. Like when every city did urban renewal and cleared, sort of depressed areas of the city, often almost always the poor areas of the city, to build these kind of shiny glass new buildings, Oklahoma City did it. They hired I.M. Pei when he was a young man. He drew up this plan. There's a map of it in my book called the Pei Plan, and it's just all of downtown is shaded just to be destroyed. And then they did it. And then they went beyond what he even said. And then when it was time to rebuild, the economy busted and they ran out of money. And you had this city that was formerly had these grand skyscrapers that one of them was modeled on the Doge's Palace in Venice. It's this beautiful white soaring skyscraper from like 1910 with all these arches and windows. And they just blew it up. And there were all these buildings like that. And it was just a downtown of empty lots full of weeds. So they did these really excessive, crazy things. But you read the biography of that guy, Stanley Draper, written by, of course, a local historian. And there's these lines in it. I quote some of them in the book that are like, other than occasionally being a little brusque with people due to his great love of Oklahoma City, Stanley Draper had no faults. And like there's a line about like his doctor told him he was a perfect specimen of a human. I mean, it's like actually I'm making connections into my mind to some other public figures right now, but it's just laughable. So the boosterism is off the charts, and this is not a booster book, as you say. It goes pretty deeply into the not only the kind of land theft that is the original sin of Oklahoma City, taking it from the tribes, but the horrific segregation and racism against its black population, all of which took me a long time to actually get to, because that's kind of it is a buried layer of their history. That said, the reception was pretty magnificent, because again, they do want national attention. And as the mayor put it to me, he's been telling people that the book is like a pay-in to the city, but one written by somebody with a postmodern sensibility, which, postmodern means
Put it on your business cards.
yeah, right, means almost everything. But that's what he's been telling people, and so some people might read this as dismissive or insulting in parts. But Oklahoma City needs to learn to thrive in a postmodern world. So it's really good for the city. So he's really embraced it, and it sits on the mayor's bookshelf now against some of the other history books I used, and that was great. The Oklahoman, actually, very, very, very conservative newspaper, ran a wonderful long review of it when it first came out, and just a couple days ago on the op-ed page, like the official rebuttal to the book came out from this guy who's like a PR. He's a PR representative for oil industry people and conservative politicians, and he wrote this. I didn't actually read the article; I couldn't bring myself to. But the tweet was like, "Boomtown is worth reading, but I think it misses the larger story of Oklahoma City, which is, I'm paraphrasing in a not nice way, but essentially." That it is a place of visionary entrepreneurs who are like improving everybody's lives through capitalism, so it's that kind of thing. So there's that. That's the official Oklahoma City pushback, but that doesn't really bother me. Yeah.
I have to ask, has Kevin Durant read it?
I doubt it. I doubt he would. I doubt any of the players would read it. Yeah. Russell Westbrook won't read it. He calls me a nasty word in the book. No, they won't read it.
So you are right that this book is, I would say, lovingly and appropriately very critical of Oklahoma City and Oklahoma State in some ways. And we do get really wonderful and informative and scathing accounts of the incredibly virulent history of segregation and racism there. We get, honestly, some of the craziest urban politics I've ever read about. But I was really curious. You began this book in the Obama administration and finished it, must have really been just kind of tightening up loose ends at that point, and then obviously published it in the Trump administration. And a lot of the more critical parts of this book are appropriately focused on its insane founding and its very, very difficult history during the civil rights era. And I'm just very curious whether your feelings about the city changed some as our national politics changed. It's obviously a deep red city in a deep red state. And I'm just curious to hear you reflect on. You're so tender towards the city in so many ways, and it's really very sweet. And truthfully, you bring the reader right along with you. Like, I was kind of in love with Oklahoma City, a place I've never been, by the end of this. But I'm curious how you feel now in light of how divisive our current politics are and how staunchly on the far side of that spectrum much of the populace is, the white populace, I should say.
Right. Oklahoma City actually is a pretty purple place now. It's alone in the state in being that. In the recent primary for the governorship, Mick Cornett, who is kind of the mild Republican, won handily in Oklahoma City. He used to be the mayor there and lost in Tulsa and everywhere else. It is a loving book for sure. And as I told I had a lot of fun talking to the people of Oklahoma City about this question, basically, and the boosterism thing. And what I said was what I actually believe, which is if you love something, then you do it the great honor of taking it seriously and speaking about it as it really is. To write in a boosterish way about something is to disrespect it deeply. So I do love the place, and therefore I write about all these things you mentioned. And I think Oklahoma State is torn between these two kind of impulses. And in my book, the great moments in the city's history are these moments where people kind of get over this Wild West mythology of the rugged American individual who stands alone outside of history and gets exactly what he or she deserves based on merits and all that stuff. and realizes, oh, I'm living surrounded by millions of people, and we're all interdependent, and we're all implicated in the same history. Some of us have won, some of us have lost because of that history, and let's kind of rationally make some decisions for the larger good. That's sort of the heroic impulse in my book, and Oklahoma City does that many, many, many times. It's always kind of fighting those two poles. The other thing I was struck by, so that was kind of there from the very beginning, back in the era of Obama, and that was always going to be the story. One thing I was really struck by was when late phase, I was going back through and just doing some fact checking and checking my research, and I started to look back through the biography of Timothy McVeigh, who is the man who bombed the Federal Building. And the buttons that he was pushing at that time were exactly the buttons of the kind of Trumpist, alt-right, white nationalist movement now. And it was eerie. I mean, he was for instance, like this whole thing about being an incel, an involuntary celibate man because women have been corrupted by feminism and won't, give you the bodily comfort you need or whatever. He was that. He was a malignant racist. He was, anti-government in every way. He was kind of this proto-Tea Party guy. He was all of that stuff. So what I've said to some people in Oklahoma City is this far-right individualist kind of Ayn Rand fantasy of life, there's a monument to that in the center of your city. It's the bombing memorial. And people don't often connect those things. But Timothy McVeigh would have been #1 Trump voter in America. Mm-hmm. So that was something that struck me really hard when I reread that material that hadn't hit me when I read it back, initially in 2013 or whatever. Yeah.
You make a really interesting choice in the book. So people who are not basketball fans, probably, as you said, their chief association with Oklahoma City, tragically enough, is that bombing. And you make a choice in the book to defer it almost as long as humanly possible, meaning every reader, of course, knows it's out there and assumes it's going to come at some point. It happens very, very late in the book, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that decision.
Yeah, for sure. Somebody told me the other day it happens on page 347 or something, which is almost the very end of the book. Several reasons for that. One was, I tell these, the motion I always make is this. There's like these weaving narratives that go, and they all kind of arc at the same moment. And there's like the history of Oklahoma City well, I start with Pangea, technically, when it was at the bottom of the ocean. But from there and the land run up to the present day. This one basketball season that really kind of stands alone for me is this almost mythic story. And then modern Oklahoma City, like this kind of year in the life of Oklahoma City. And all those things come together at the very end of the book, in the final section of the book. Like everything kind of climaxes, some of it horribly, some of it wonderfully. And so the bombing had to go there for that reason, because of the narrative arc. I think maybe deeper than that, and maybe this is what influenced me to make that the structure, was that I think as a writer on some deep level, I don't like to feel bullied into writing about things. And I felt like, well, that's what everybody knows about this place. And I'm writing about this place because it fascinates me in ways that people don't know about. So I don't want to start there. I want to establish this place, as a deep place full of complex humans. I want to introduce you to all of these particular humans and stories. I want you to understand the landscape of this place, which is so strange, and has such an excessive history, so that when the bombing happens, all these people who are kind of winding through that day very well by that point, and the landscape that it's affecting in the middle of the city, and that history. And so it's almost hitting, you're kind of a part of it. So you're not reading about it like you were in newspapers in 1995. You're experiencing it more from the inside. So I think that's why I did that.
Sure, I was very struck by then. You really do know a lot about downtown Oklahoma City, including the fact that per urban renewal, most of it's already been blown up already, intentionally. Right. But you have a sense of just what a kind of desolate and just starting to come back together landscape it was. So it does kind of fall very hard.
And the Federal Building was one of the few buildings that was one of the few new kind of showpiece buildings that was built after all that destruction of urban renewal because of federal funds. I also like to tell Oklahomans that not only do they exist because of the federal government, because it gave them free land that wasn't theirs, but they were rescued and bailed out by the federal government again and again and again and again throughout their history. There's settlers who said, get the tribes out of there. We know what to do with this land better than they do. They were starving to death in less than a year, and the federal government had to send bags of flour and rice and beans. So, again, in a blasted landscape, this federal building, the kind of beautiful, interesting, architecturally federal building with this huge wall of glass, was like one of the only architectural jewels in this blasted landscape. And so there is, and a place of steady employment in a city that had just busted and the economy was dead. So it was like this little node of life thanks to the federal government in the middle of the city. And so the tragedy hits on so many levels.
Yeah, one of the ways that this book is about the entire country and not just this one place is I very much appreciated how effectively you write about this national tension between, or just about the role of the federal government and how often and deeply in so many places it's profoundly despised in this unbelievably hypocritical and paradoxical way.
Totally.
And you're so effective at kind of conveying the particularly pure form of that insanity that abounds in Oklahoma City, it seems. But Sam, I want to ask you a kind of structural or writerly question. It's related to the delaying of the bombing. You describe kind of interweaving these sections. It has an interesting effect for the reader, which is you are, of course, right that ultimately there's a kind of chronological endpoint. We arrive kind of at the present day. We arrive at the culmination of a basketball season. But because of the way you've told this story, all along the way, there's a kind of very rare and interesting absence of chronology in the sense that literally like the Oklahoma City Thunder makes it to the playoffs before the city's been founded. And
Right.
I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about, is that another like writerly, like, I don't like to be forced to do things a certain way? Were you resistant to, editors again and again will tell you like, just write it chronologically. It has a lot of rewards. You can bring people along in the story. And your book is so radically defiant of that proposal and told in these kind of vignettes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if you can just talk us through how you arrived at the structure of the book.
Yeah. I've always believed that nonfiction, literary nonfiction, if that's what we want to call it, should be as ambitious structurally, stylistically, everything as fiction, as any other kind of literature or poetry. And so I think the structure of a project should be determined by the subject of the project. And in this case, I remember thinking, Kathryn and I used to walk around. We both used to live in the same little town in New York, and we used to walk around for hours sometimes talking about writing and our projects. And Kathryn is really obsessed with structure. Yeah. And I remember you asking me like, well, what's the structure? Where do you start? And thinking like, God, I'm really neglecting structure because I'm just writing like pieces all over the place right now. And at a certain point I realized, well, what I'm actually doing is I am mimicking the land run. I'm mimicking the formation of this city in the structure of my book. All of these different stories come from 10,000 different directions and just hit each other. I call Oklahoma City a sort of Hadron super collider of a place where things just come from everywhere and crash together over all the layers of its history, whether it's the tribes of the plains or European settlers or the people of the land run. And so my book was that. And one of the great chapters of this history is that after all that stuff that I read you, after the land run, after Ojo, here's your mule, well, the sun comes up on day 2 and everybody looks around and realizes, we just claimed every little piece of land in this entire area. There's no organization, no structure whatsoever. There's no room for streets. There's no negative space. How do we make this into a functional city? When making a street means you have to tell 30 people, your lot's no longer count as places to live anymore because we need to be able to function in this town. And so they had to very laboriously figure that out. That was the process of my book as well. It's like all this stuff crashed together, and then I looked around and was like, oh no. I tried different things. At one point, I didn't tell anyone this until after it was all done. I definitely did not tell my wife, but I was considering organizing it all based on the underground structure of prairie dog colonies, because that's like, the original residents there, kind of. And they're these incredibly beautifully elaborate structures that have dedicated bedrooms and bathrooms and all kinds of stuff down there, and these false bottoms to fool black-footed ferrets. And so I was going to do that. I
That's why it was really fun to walk around the little town and talk to Sam about writing.
I remember researching prairie dogs, like checking out books from the library for like a week and a half, and then I gave it up.
I mean, I'm honestly so curious, what would a prairie dog structure look like?
I don't know.
Sam, I remember a lot of those walks, and I remember when this book was only an idea plus a magazine feature about a basketball team, and I remember when it was a pile of beautiful, interesting stories about history, and you hadn't figured out the structure yet. And I had the great pleasure of being along for a lot of this ride. And as with, I think, most large and kind of appropriately, seriously taken projects, it was hard in spots and slow and difficult. And I'm wondering if you can just kind of talk a little bit about what was the process like for you?
Okay, we're sitting here in August 2018. My original deadline for the book was April 1st, 2014. And I remember my editor saying at some point, maybe a year after that, like, we cannot push this deadline again. This book simply cannot be pushed further. I think there was a notion at the publisher that that the basketball would be a bigger portion of the book, and it'd be a little bit more like, here's a behind the scenes look at a fascinating history, or have a fascinating season in the history of the NBA with some other stuff attached to it. And it really blew up and became this bigger epic in which the basketball is its own kind of narrative, but it's not the narrative, It was just a really hard slog. There were about 8 months where I took leave from the Times Magazine and was just working on this for sometimes like 12 hours a day. And I got in these deep trances. I wrote a lot of the land run stuff at that time. Sometimes I would look down and I would like not be wearing a shirt all of a sudden, and I didn't know what happened. It was that was a really intense period. I gained a lot of weight. And then after that, it was this really difficult thing of trying to do my job at the magazine while also trying to push this thing further, centimeter by centimeter, and weave all these things together and make it work. And it took me 5 years of book writing to get this done. That was after the initial article came out.
You have 2 kids on top of that full-time job.
Right.
Was this just around the edges? Was this like structurally, how were you kind of making time for the multiple demands on your life?
Yeah, it was kind of around the edges. It was, and my family was very frustrated at a lot of points. I remember my son asking me, well, like, I turned the whole thing in, and he's like, well, now you're done? And I said, well, no, I probably have to do some, and I remember him just like fighting back tears. And it was so heartbreaking. It was a heartbreaking process for a lot of people at a lot of different moments, but I'm really proud of it. I think it's the best thing I've ever written by a long shot. I have a question for you. You once told me, I remember this because I hadn't started the book yet, but you once told me that, or maybe I just started, that writers write differently when they write a book than they ever have before. Like their writing necessarily adapts or evolves. Do you think that was did my writing feel different in this book than it, because my magazine writing well?
Such an interesting question. I mean, I kind of stand by that statement because you're called upon to do such different things at book length than you are at magazine length, unless it's truly just a collection of essays, which your book very much is not, despite being episodic. It's incredibly cumulative. stylistically, you're pure Sam, and it's purely delightful. This book is incredibly funny. It's incredibly smart. There's a huge amount of sentence-by-sentence pleasure in it. It's interesting. I mean, I actually think you sustain a style that many people could not or would not at that length, meaning you could probably have 1/3 as many truly sparkling sentences and people would still receive this as a great book. The labor you put into it is very clear because you actually kind of, you do maintain at a very high level of prose throughout the entire thing, and not just in the sense of like well put together sentences, but an incredible amount of time and thought into like the perfect analogy or, you know, just the kind of fact deployed exactly right. Do I think it's very different from the rest of your work? I mean, it's, you know, it's honestly a level of storytelling that I think is far above and beyond, partly just for reasons of space and constraint, that I've seen in the rest of your work.
Yeah, I think in terms of, I do. I think in terms of narrative, yeah. I think in my magazine pieces, I could get away with writing sparkling sentences that made me laugh and putting these kind of modular sections next to one another. And in this, there is sort of a more narrative energy and momentum. Yeah.
Okay. It sounds like I'm being told we need to wrap up so that the audience has some time to ask some questions. So
okay,
we can do that.
Any questions?
We have time for just 2 questions.
Gentleman in the middle there.
You were saying about how you like fell in love with Oklahoma City, but you never told us why or how.
Why or how I fell in love with Oklahoma City. It is a place that just has a feeling that is unlike any other city I've been in. Part of that, I think, is there are very odd proportions to the place. Like, I was driving around DC today and driving through Georgetown, and like there's all these beautiful row houses and apartments, and the streets are kind of width that I am trained to recognize. In Oklahoma City, the proportions are bizarre. The streets are kind of huge. They're very empty. You feel the Great Plains in the city. There's this wind. There's this wind that blows from south to north constantly. The trees lean to the north. There are like pine trees that are pointing like fingers to the north. And so those things were very striking. And immediately I was like, wow, this is a different place. I think it was, you know, cliche alert, the people I met. My first interview was this ride around town for maybe 4 hours with the police chief, who was just the most like deeply decent man. It struck me like decent in the real sense, like not the debased modern sense, but just such a decent man who was telling me the history of the city, and he so plainly loved it. And so there were many encounters like that where I was just touched by somebody's humanity and their attachment to this place. And I think I fell in love with it through the people. And then as a writer, this American history that I did not know was tremendously exciting at every single step. And that's really why I fell in love with it. Sometimes when I'd go back after a long gap, like after two years or something, I remember driving from the airport into the city and just laughing out loud in my car. Like, this place is what it's like I've elevated in my mind to this incredible universal story of humanity. Like this place, because coming from New York City, it looks so, you know, like abandoned in certain ways. But yeah, then I would get into town, I'd start seeing the places and the people. And for me, it became this incredible layering of stories. Every street I go down, and the wind is almost like you feel like, it felt to me like the physical manifestation of time, like blowing over me. It was like this weird American history touching my body at all times. That's a very abstract answer, but there you go. Also, there's good coffee shops. Okay, one more question? Okay.
Would you refresh my memory? Didn't one of the Chesapeake Energy people come to an untimely end?
Oh, for sure. Yes, indeed. Chesapeake Energy, one of the titanic oil and gas companies of Oklahoma City, sponsor of the Thunder, one of the owners of the company was one of the co-owners of the basketball team in the arena. If you watch a game on TV, they always refer to it as the Chesapeake Energy Arena. it was run by this perfect Oklahoma City character named Aubrey McClendon, who was a wild, flamboyant gambler in all areas of his life. He had like a $10 million wine collection. He had this like historically huge collection of maps. And he was also essentially bankrupt because everything he owned, he leveraged into, further loans that he would then gamble on all these properties out in the middle of nowhere that might have gas underneath them. And he was just dynamic in this kind of whirling dervish of a guy. I saw him every single game I went to, sitting on the baseline, cheering for the team, dancing to the band at halftime. And toward the end of this narrative, I don't want to spoil it, but I will. When the basketball stuff is really climaxing, the town is really just enraptured. Aubrey McClendon was about to be federally indicted for some shady land deals that he had done, like rigged bids on land. And he drove out very early in the morning to the distant, abandoned edge of Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City, by the way, at one point was the largest city on the face of the earth. It expanded to be nearly 700 square miles. It's huge. You can drive forever and never leave the city. He drives way out toward the edge of that, and at 90 miles per hour, crashes his car into a concrete overpass. Car explodes. I drove out there. It's still black. The overpass is still black. And there's a shrine to him. There are work helmets, Chesapeake Energy work helmets, and there are Thunder t-shirts, and there are photographs and candles. And they had to identify him by his teeth. I mean, it was just this incredibly dramatic end to this man. The person I drove out there with was this activist and rapper from the east side of town, from the black side of town, and he looked at it and he was like, man, he's in Jamaica. He just left a couple teeth and he went to Jamaica. And there are those kind of rumors around because he was this larger than life figure. And there are people who will argue he didn't kill himself, that it was an accident, but there was no sign of breaking. He didn't wear a seatbelt. So it looks like a suicide. So yeah, he did. Untimely end. Yep. All right. I think that's
great
it.
Note to end on, but
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for coming out.